Classical music will forever be in debt to Johann Sebastian Bach. No other composer, before him or since, has possessed the phenomenal musical insight he was blessed with. Whatever form of music he touched, it soared to the highest height. He was the grandmaster of technique, and no one has come close to being his equal.
In God we trust. That's what he wrote for. He wrote for God. He wrote for the church. He wrote subsequently also for some instruments that were around his neighborhood, so to speak. There's no great mystery. You know, I'd like to take the mystery out of what it is that music is. The mystery about music and about Bach is the fact that we can today, 300 years later, sit here and talk about it. That's mystery.
Just the music itself is so sublime and on such a wonderfully beautiful yet complex, and it's sometimes very simple plane, that and the breadth and scope of Bach's music is so staggering. It's just deeply humbling.
If not for Bach, this world would be very different. He changed the world, you know. If you think of his preludes and fugues for keyboard, if you think of his cello suites, you know, it's like a god, you know, it's like a Bible. For me as a musician, I have no other words for this music. It's the basis for everything that we do. It's a basis for all the other composers.
One of the essential negativities of Bach's life was he was at the very end of a period, especially so in Germany. The Baroque ended earlier in Germany than it did in France or England. And he was really the last Baroque composer in Germany. And so everything that he wrote was in essence thought of as old-fashioned at the time. He was not considered a forward-looking person.
Bach was not entirely respected as a composer to the extent we respect him now. When he was alive, he was largely thought of as a great organist and improviser. And the Leipzig newspaper, when he died, wrote an interesting obituary saying all these nice things about him, but he said his greatest gift to music was his sons. Musical fashion had already changed. Bach essentially was the culmination of the contrapuntal era, when the play of different voices was what music was about. Musical style changed with his sons, and he at that point was considered old hat. And really, he went into eclipse for some generations, and it wasn't until Felix Mendelssohn rediscovered his music and championed it that we have the consistent respect for Bach that we have today.
Mendelssohn rediscovered Bach's music because he became the conductor of the Gewandhaus Orchestra in Leipzig. And he was also an organist. Mendelssohn was an organist. And he knew the music never ceased to exist. I mean, it wasn't as if it wasn't in the stream of music. Mozart knew the well-tempered clavier while he played it. There were certain pieces that existed, mostly the keyboard music and the organ music. What Mendelssohn really did was rediscover the much broader compositions, the Passions, the B minor Mass, the really big pieces.
You think of all the church work that he did, all those cantatas he wrote, the wonderful works like the St. Matthew, St. John Passion, the B minor Mass. I mean, these are works which just, they're absolutely mind-blowing works. But, so there's this great guy who does this like a god, but he's also a man who had 20 children. And sometimes we forget the earthy side of him. I think we really should remember it when we perform his music.
Johann Sebastian was born in 1685 in Eisenach, Germany. He was the youngest of 8 children and grew up to father 20 of his own with 2 wives. Many of his children were also named Johann. 4 of Bach's sons, Karl, Wilhelm, Friedrich, and Johann Christian also became composers. Their music was considered revolutionary, and Johann Christian enjoyed more fame while he was alive than his father ever did.
Bach is one of those musicians who became a musician because it was the family business. His father was a musician, his brother taught him, he was a boy chorister, the whole thing was very logical. He could have been a carpenter with the same attitude, except that this was a carpenter with genius in music. And so he just gradually moved in, got church appointments, at one point got a court appointment, which was rare in his experience. He was largely a church musician for most of his life, and he married, he had children. Boy, did he have children. 2 wives, 20 children. He was probably the most prolific of the great composers in that sense. And so he had to struggle to support a very large family, which meant writing a lot of notes, which he certainly did.
He had a job to do, write music, and he just went about it without any fuss. And without any sort of hoopla on how marvelous that he was and how he obviously stood out from all his colleagues at the time.
When you study Bach's music, you soon realize that it's incredibly difficult. But you know, the amazing thing about it is that you can jump into any one of his compositions at any point and never feel like you're intruding. That's the beauty of its flow.
I mean, he was a genius, you see, and he was also a tremendous technical master, and he was interested in the craft, so he could take this and play around with it in all sorts of ways. And there's nobody who could match his mastery in that.
I once asked a marvelous composer friend of mine, why hadn't the Art of the Fugue been finished by anyone? He said, oh, well, since the last 200 years, a lot of people have tried, a lot of great musicians, great composers. But he said, Lynn, it is a reverse double fugue, you know. I don't even know what a reverse double fugue is.
Those of us who have gone through music school, we've all had to write a fugue. You learn the rules. There are these incredible rules of writing a fugue. Counterpoint, subject 1, subject 2, the keys that you have to modulate. There's very prescribed rules. But it takes a genius to take the rules and make phenomenal music out of them. And that's Bach.
Bach, like just about every composer of his day, wanted to ingratiate himself with the people who had power to give commissions and authority, the Margrave of Brandenburg being one of them. So he wrote a half-dozen concertos and inscribed them with a very long and flowery dedication to the Margrave. Now, they're very interesting pieces. They're based in the concerto grosso style, but each one is quite different from the others. We don't have any record that the Margrave paid the least bit of attention to this effort by this composer from Leipzig. But in fact, it was an effort to say, I am an obedient servant of the system of patronage, and perhaps you can send something my way. All he got for his rewards was eternal glory. There's a lot of controversy today about how the Brandenburg concertos ought to be performed. For most of the 20th century, they were performed by large modern orchestras. Scholars now often believe that they should be played with only one player per part, that in effect they're chamber music, not orchestral music. But because Bach is less interested in color than he is in line, you can actually make it work both as small-scale music and as large-scale music.
I don't think it had occurred yet to Bach that the harpsichord was going to be changed into the piano, and that the old violin was going to start sounding like a modern violin. All the instruments were still in their infancy of development.
This is an old instrument. This is 250 years old. I don't know if Bach was played on it 250 years ago. It certainly didn't have the mechanics, but I'm not going to play Bach the way I play Tchaikovsky, for the simple reason that the music is different. Okay, you don't speak French the way you speak Chinese, do you? You don't. You speak Chinese and you speak French. You may have the same idiomatic natural extension, which is the accent that you were born with, but even that you can develop. So I'm not going to go, because I have a natural, a more powerful instrument. I'm going to try and imagine what that was like. But we don't have real proof of what it really sounded like. We have no idea. We can just imagine the church, we can imagine its ambiance, etc.
Well, when Bach first wrote the Fifth Brandenburg Concerto, which has three soloists, harpsichord, which he presumably played, violin and flute, they worked together. And in the first instance, he did a different cadenza. He did a shorter cadenza. And then he decided to do this great showpiece cadenza, which is a huge cadenza in relation to the size of the movement, and quite unbalanced in a way. But it's a great piece of music.
I mean, it's a tremendously difficult cadenza, actually. Every time I play it, I have to practice it. You know, you sort of think that you get to a point in music where you can play certain pieces without really having to work them through, you know. That is not a piece that you can do that with. It's just fiercely difficult. Every fingering is as rough as it could be. So I think he saw it, you know, as his own sort of signature, his own sense of presenting himself very brilliantly.
Bach became a modern composer. With the Brandenburg Concertos, he gives us the impression that nothing else can be written that way. And unfortunately, he stopped at 6. He took form, and within the limitation of the time, he converted the non-convertible and made him listen to music, to real music.
It took Bach more than 2 years to complete the 6 concertos, only to be royally stiffed. Not only did the Margrave of Brandenburg not pay Bach, he didn't even thank him or ever use the concertos. For if this chance meeting between Bach and Brandenburg had never occurred, the Margrave would be hard-pressed to even merit a footnote in history. But Bach made history and established himself as the first famous and arguably the greatest composer that ever lived.
I just feel with him, like perhaps only one or two other composers of the last 500 years, feel it is such a privilege to be able to be a musician.